Hello and welcome to episode 49 of Question and Answer. I am your host, Panyo Basa, and this is my beverage. As a good book says, man cannot live by bread alone. There must also be a beverage. And we've got, even though it's been less than 2 weeks, still we've got a fair amount of questions here. And before I start answering them, I would just like to share with you a strange bit of information. I was looking at my YouTube analytics and I got this strange information that over the past year, 95% of my viewers have been male. No, wait, 97% of my viewers have been male. And then if you go with just viewing time, it gets even worse. It's like viewing time is 99.5% by males. So it's of the viewing time of this video, or of my videos in general over the past year, only 0.5% of it has been watched by females. And I think they're almost entirely between the ages of 45 and 54. So I don't know what the problem is with American women, or just women who watch YouTube in general. I mean, are all Western female Buddhists except for like three or four like communist Jewish lesbians or something? I don't know. It's not even funny, really. I mean, I should cry or something. I should be more touchy feely and just cry about some, I don't know, intense personal something. I'll have to work on it. Anyway, after I button my shirt pocket here, I'll start answering questions. And okay, that one's buttoned. All right, so the first one is from Johannes. And Johannes says, what does early Buddhism and you yourself think of demons and exorcism? Is it a common Buddhist belief that a demon or Mara is the cause of unwholesome mental states? Maybe always. Well, in Buddhism, it's pretty much subjective, and it seems to me that Mara is largely superfluous because he can't do anything to you that is in conflict with your own karma anyway, and your own karma is your own mental states. It's like the momentum of your mental states, especially your will or your volition. But nevertheless, in early Buddhism, there is mention of demonic possession. Um, the only case I can think of that just flat out describes demonic possession, I assume there's more in there, but the only case that really stands out in my memory is there's an obscure Vinaya rule saying that monks are not allowed to eat raw meat or drink raw blood unless they are possessed by a demonic entity. And I guess what happens is that demonic entities crave raw meat or raw blood, which is it's a common belief in Burma also. Necromancers will attract spirits by putting out raw meat or raw blood. And once they get their fill, then I guess they're satisfied or something, and they let go and they go away. There's also mention in the Digha Nikaya of spirit mediums. So I guess that's kind of like a possession by some kind of spirit, but they're not really like violently taking over your body or anything. Exorcism, the closest thing to exorcism that I've experienced in Theravada Buddhism is just calling in monks to chant Purita, especially the Metta Sutta, which is like the panacea of getting rid of pesky spirits or invisible beings, that sort of thing. Um, but with regard, it seems like the point of the question here is that does demonic possession really cause a lot of people behaving badly or having bad mental states? And you read the New Testament of the Bible, it's like everyone and his sister was possessed by demons. Um, but in Buddhism, as I said practically at the beginning of this answer, it's much more subjective. It's really a matter of your own mental states, which are your own responsibility, and demons and so forth really can't mess with you unless it's just your karma to be messed with. So I see Mara as kind of superfluous. I don't think he's really necessary in the grand scheme of things. But nevertheless, I mean, demonic possession is recognized in ancient Pali texts, and exorcism is mainly a case of not so much driving them out in the name of Gautama Buddha as just essentially beaming love at them. And then usually, I mean, they're possessing someone because they're unhappy, they have some sort of need, and then you just satisfy the need and they go away. Buddhism is kind of uncompromising in its nonviolence even towards demonic entities. So I'll just move on to the next question by Johannes, which is, when the Buddha explains non-self of the khandhas, he goes by this logic. Is the I changing or unchanging? Changing. Is what is changing sukha or dukkha? Dukkha. Is what is changing and dukkha worth to be called self? No. By this logic, why is nibbana not called a self? Well, nibbana is completely off the scale, and a self presumably would be some sort of entity that can be recognized or perceived, grasped somehow, and nibbana is just completely off the scale. So I don't think anybody really identifies with nibbana anyway. So I guess that would be a kind of a simple, short answer to that. I really don't think anybody really identifies with nibbana, even though in the Upanishads you've got Brahman, which is more or less roughly equivalent to nibbana, which is considered to be the self, but they've got a different approach to looking at these things. First, they reify Brahman or ultimate reality so that you can get some sort of grasp on it and identify with it. But Buddhism, early Buddhism especially, and some schools of Mahayana just refuse to reify the absolute or ultimate reality. It's just totally off the samsaric scale, and so you can't really identify with it. And even the Hindus, the Vedantists, who are identifying their self with Brahman, it's not really Brahman that they're identifying with. It's just a concept in their mind, the concept Brahman. And that's the same way if you identify with Nibbana, you're not identifying with Nibbana, you're identifying with the concept of Nibbana. So I think I'll just move on to the next question. Also from Johannes. And he says, Goenka will say samadhi is control over the mind, while Ajahn Brahm will say it's just letting go. Also, Christian contemplation and prayer will have more likely the notion of completely surrendering yourself to God. Oh, completely surrendering yourself to God. In your opinion, what is more likely to be right concentration? And Johannes is European, and he's got strange quotation marks here in his questions. Like the first one is upside down, you know. So anyway, samadhi. Let's see. Samadhi is control over the mind. Ajahn Brahm will say just letting go. Christian contemplation. In your opinion, what is more likely to be right concentration? Well, if you look in the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, right concentration in Orthodox Theravada is defined as the four jhanas. And like I was saying in a recent video, I do not think that all four jhanas are necessarily superhuman mental states, which they sort of evolved into being in later Orthodox tradition. But right concentration is your mind is focused on a wholesome object as a kind of meditation. That would probably be like a good Orthodox um, definition of concentration. Just keeping your mind, focused on a wholesome dharmic object of contemplation. At least until you get to fourth jhana, and then your mind is just silent and wide open, like the Christian mystics, who they call it high contemplation, where your mind is just empty. But according to them, your mind isn't totally empty, because even though you eject everything you can possibly eject, there's still this substratum of like the spirit of God that resides there. And I think I should just move on to the next question. I'm starting to wade out into deep waters here, and I could spend 15 minutes trying to backtrack and get out of the water. So I'll just move on to the next question here, and this is from Mary, spelled Merry. And Mary says, how can you explain that in fourth jhana you have super mindfulness and no feeling pain that you have in your body? For example, broken leg. Noticing pain is also mindfulness. How does that work? Well, one thing is if you're in jhana and all of a sudden your leg gets broken, somebody just runs over you while you're sitting there in meditation in their car. They run over you in their car while you're sitting there in meditation. You'd probably knock you out of the jhana. I would assume maybe fourth jhana, where you're just like mastering. You're at the highest level of jhana. Still, I'm reminded of one time when I was a college student and I happened to take a certain psychoactive substance and I was walking around with shorts on. This was like May or June, and there were stinging nettles. And I was walking through these stinging nettles and I could feel it on my bare legs, but I didn't really identify it as pain. It was just a kind of energy or sensation or something. And it may be that someone at the very highest level of meditation, if they experience some sort of damage to their body, like the broken leg that Mary here is talking about, it might still be experienced, but just as a kind of neutral, energy or sensation. So you'd still be mindful of whatever is coming up. I really don't think that if you're in jhana, you just go completely numb, or that you become unconscious like a hibernating squirrel, or go into a kind of suspended animation or anything like that. So you're still very awake. You're more awake than you would be normally. But I think the main point is that either if all of a sudden your leg breaks, it's going to snap you out of the meditation, or you're going to experience it as a kind of neutral something, just a kind of energetic thing going on. And you'll be detached from it. It won't be you. You won't identify with it. So we'll just move on to Mary's next question here. I knew that in Patimokkha there is no rule against eating garlic, and in Bhikkhuni rules there is. Where is the rule for monks to not eat garlic? Well, it's in the Kandakas. In the Vinaya Pitaka, you've got two main groups. There's 5 books. The fifth book, what is it? Starts with a P, not Parayana. The Pariwara? No, not the Pariwara either. There's 5 books. The fifth book is very late. It was apparently composed in Sri Lanka. So one of the latest additions to the Tipitaka is just review. I think there's only one new rule in the fifth book, which is, at least I only noticed one new rule, and that is making the sound of a drum with your mouth. If you're a monk, you're doing the boombox stuff with your mouth. That's against the rules. But you've got the Patimokkha rules, and you've got what is called the Kandakas, the Mahavaga and the Chulavaga. And this rule against a monk eating raw garlic unless he is sick is found in the Kandakas. And I don't remember exactly where. It would either be, there's like just a miscellaneous collection of rules in the Chulavaga, and I think it's in the Mahavaga, there's the chapter on medicine. So it could be in the chapter on medicine, and if it's not there, then I'd look in the miscellaneous chapter in the Chulavaga. But I'm pretty sure it'd be in one of those two. There's lots of rules that are beyond the Patimokkha rules. There's 227 Patimokkha rules, but altogether, I've estimated that there's like between 2,000 and 3,000 rules. Like even the rules about shaving your head is not in the Patimokkha. Or the allowable colors for robes, the allowable materials for robes, how to sew it, and all that. That's not even in the Patimokkha. There's lots of relatively important rules that are not in the Patimokkha, which is kind of strange, but that's just how it is. And some of them are just sort of like appendixes to certain rules. Like I think it's the very first Parajika rule, if I remember correctly. There's just this extra rule tacked onto that's not considered part of the Patimokkha, that makes it illegal or against the rules for a monk to make a hut out of mud and then build a fire inside the hut to bake the hut so it doesn't melt in the rain. Sort of like you're cooking it like a big pot, and that is against the rules because there's all kinds of tiny insects and so forth that live in wet mud. So, I mean, it's in the Patimokkha section of the rules, but it's not a Patimokkha rule. It's just this extra rule. But if you read the Kandakas, it's just chock full of all kinds of rules. Rules about using the bathroom, rules about just when you can and cannot bow to another monk, that sort of thing. All sorts of rules. So I'll just move on to Mary's next question. Please comment on 10 fetters. Was you able to extinguish any of them? The easiest ones would probably be attachment to rites and rituals and ill will. I think that they are in reverse order for some reason. Ignorance, which always come first. Here it is last, and self-view that apparently only arahants don't have. Here comes first. Weird. Well, to tell you the truth, I was never really interested in memorizing the lists, the four of these and the seven of those and the 37 of the other. Um, it just intuitively, it just didn't gel with me. I really don't think that the Buddha himself was teaching people just lists of things to memorize. That I'm sure he kept it like intuitive and relatively simple. Like the Atthakavagga is simplicity itself. But I refreshed my memory by looking up the 10 fetters in this Buddhist dictionary. And anyone who is interested in Pali philosophical terms or just Theravada Buddhist philosophical terms, this is a good book to have by Ñāṇatiloka. And I'm pretty sure he wrote it in a British concentration camp because he was a German monk living in Ceylon, it was called at the time, which was a British colony. So he was thrown into a concentration camp where he wrote this. It has been sort of redone because later editors, especially I think it's Ñāṇaponika, changed some of his definitions just because there had been like established precedent with regard to certain words that were used as renderings. Like I think he changed taints or like what is it? The asawas. Ñāṇatiloka called it bias, and then that got changed to taint or canker or something. But anyway, the 10 fetters here, or the samyojanas. The 10 samyojanas here. Fetters. There are 10 fetters tying beings to the wheel of existence, namely 1. Personality belief or Sakaya Ditti. 2. Skeptical doubt or Vichikicha, and I'm kind of skeptical of the definition of Vichikicha as skeptical doubt. 3. Clinging to mere rules and ritual or Silabhata Paramasa, and that one also is like the standard orthodox traditional definition, which I think could use a little qualification. 4. Sensuous craving or Kamaraga. 5. Ill will or Vyapada. 6. Craving for fine material existence or Rupa Raga. 7. Craving for immaterial existence or Arupa Raga. 8. Conceit or Mana. 9. Restlessness or Udacha. And 10. Ignorance or Avidya. And he continues here, the first 5 of these are called lower fetters, as they tie to the sensuous world. The latter 5 are called higher fetters, as they tie to the higher worlds. For example, the fine material and immaterial world. He who is free from numbers 1 to 3 is a Sotapanna or stream winner, that is, one who has entered the stream to Nibbana, as it were. He who, besides these 3 fetters, has overcome 4 and 5 in their grosser form is called a Sakadagami, a once returner to this sensuous world. He who is fully freed from 1 through 5 is an Anagami or non-returner to the sensuous world. He who is freed from all 10 fetters is called an Arahant, a perfectly holy one, according to this book. So, yeah, the reason why they seem to be in reverse order is because the first 5 fetters are the lower fetters, and they're the easiest to get rid of. And so you get rid of the easiest ones first. But I really don't put a lot of I don't put a lot of emphasis on this kind of thing. I mean, just like the list of the 10 fetters or like the hindrances, and you know, it's it's really not necessary. When I was ordained, there was a monk that was ordained at the same ceremony as me, and he would just he was like the disciple of this scholar monk, and I mean he would just be memorizing lists. I mean that was like that and meditation were pretty much what he was basing his monk's life on. And I just could not relate to it at all. I mean, the meditation part I could relate to. That was about our only overlap in our practice. So it's really not that important to memorize all this stuff. It's good to have it as like a reference, so you can look it up and see what people are talking about. And if anything really resonates with you, then that's good. If it helps you to practice, helps you to be, a good and happy person, that's fine. But yeah, I really do not think that these lists and also just the rules, like the the Sotapanna, that he has eliminated the first three. Let's see here. I'll look it back up again. The first three, which are personality belief, Sakaya Ditti, that's belief in a self, really. Skeptical doubt, Vichikicha, and skeptical doubt, I would consider that more like indecision. Where it's sort of like a conflict of two different ideas, and you're not fully behind either one, that kind of thing. And three, clinging to mere rules and ritual, or silabata paramasa. And if you read the Atthakavagga, you see that this is largely an artifact of later developments. That silabata paramasa really is morality itself. It's not just rules and rituals. I mean, it's even morality itself is included in this. If you cling to it, if you think you're going to be liberated or enlightened through morality, or according to the Atthakavagga, through immorality, either through amorality, I mean, it's largely it's just another samyojana. It's another fetter. So there is that. So let's see here. Next question from Mary. And this is strange because it's not a question at all. But he says it's for the Q&A. I mean, he starts off for Q&A, and then he says, I think it would be better that Buddhism wasn't true. If I have to live this life or any other life over and over again, I would literally kill myself, and that would be pointless. So amazingly, hope Buddhism is not true. Well, if Buddhism is true and you kill yourself, you just get reborn again. Unless you somehow become enlightened before the moment of death. So yeah, I mean that's kind of what Buddhism is trying to do, is get off the wheel. But it reminds me of when I was a young monk, still living in America, before I went to Asia. There was this Jehovah Witness guy who would come to convert me, and he'd visit like once a week, and I just kind of enjoyed arguing or debating with him, sort of discussing with him. And it seemed to me that the Jehovah Witnesses, I mean, if they're right, that would be good for me. It would be better for me if the Jehovah's Witnesses were right than if Buddhism is right, because Jehovah Witnesses don't believe in hell. They think a good God isn't going to punish people with eternal torment, that the bad people just get poofed out of existence. The good people, on the other hand, aside from 144,000 that go up and get administrative jobs in heaven, the rest of everybody get paradise on this earth, which consists of, if you look at the Jehovah Witness literature, of essentially picking fruits and vegetables, going on picnics, and hugging wild animals. You're out there hugging the grizzly bear. And yeah, I think just being poofed out of existence would be preferable to that. So maybe the Jehovah Witnesses are right, and we'll just get poofed out of existence because we're not good Jehovah Witnesses. Then I'll just move on to Mary's next and last question, which is kind of an easy one. Do you like the acoustic part of To Live Is To Die by Metallica? And if I was a nicer guy, I suppose I could have just listened to the song by Metallica before answering the question. But I have no idea what the song sounds like I've never really been much into Metallica. Um, I'm not exactly sure when they reached their peak, but pretty much stopped listening to music like in the late 80s, um, up until just after I stopped being a monk. Or, well, no, after I came back to America and there was internet and YouTube, then I could listen to music again. But so, do I like the acoustic part of "To Live Is to Die" by Metallica? I'd have to say no, I don't like it because I don't even know what it is. So, I mean, if I was a nicer guy, I'd listen to it first, but I'm not. So I'll just move on to the next question, and this is from Siovaksh and Sipat Zidana, our good friend Siovaksh and Sipat Zidana, and he says, "What do you think about people who claim to have achieved these arupa states? Also, I heard Nirodha Samapati, like suspended animation, is also a thing in some yogic traditions, but I don't know if they are the exact same." I think he submitted this question under a video I did that wasn't a Q&A, but it was about um, like the evolution of the concept of jhana in early Buddhism. And it includes the arupa jhanas, or just the formless realms. And I was saying that it's just an artifact um, that the formless realms may have been. There's a number of theories that you could use to explain it. I mean, it's not just clear cut. You have to do like a detective work, and there's hypotheses and theories. And I think my favorite theory is that these formless states were originally attempted descriptions of enlightenment or nirvana that later on just got outmoded and became obsolete or even heresy. And so they were well known. They're actually in like very old suttas, and so they just got uh, like relegated to this state that's not nirvana, but it's a very advanced state. So you can say, well, I attain this and I'm enlightened, therefore, and then you can have this scholarly monk say, no, no, you may have attained that, but that's not nirvana. That's just this, the form of neither perception nor non-perception, or the form of the realm of infinite consciousness, or whatever. So, so what he's asking here is, what do you think about people who claim to have achieved these arupa states? Well, I'm sure they've attained states like that. Well, some of them have, but yeah, it's going to be different people. I mean, some people can just deceive themselves, or they're just not very deep meditators, and then they get into a slightly more expansive state, and they think they've hit the formless realms. Um, but he's mentioning like yogic traditions, and there's very advanced yogis um, that get into all sorts of these advanced realms, or advanced meditative states, or contemplative states. And yeah, I think they would fit somewhere in the four jhanas category. Maybe the highest would be fourth jhana. And I mean, if you're interested in this sort of thing, you can just refer to the recent video I did on the evolution of jhana. But yeah, I have read about certain Hindu swamis who can go into these states where they apparently are like in a state of suspended animation. It's like their breathing and heartbeat almost stop. They seem dead to the world. But when they come out of that state, they can repeat what everyone in the room was saying. So, I mean, they looked unconscious, but really they weren't unconscious. Um, so that wouldn't be Nirodha Samapati. I mean, Nirodha Samapati is, again, I mean, you're just unconscious. It's the cessation of perception and feeling. And according to Orthodox tradition, if you don't have mental states, you don't have consciousness either. So, I mean, it's just like a coma, like a self-induced temporary coma. And only extremely advanced meditators can do it. I mean, you've got to be a saint to be able to get into that stage. And there's no mention of it really in the early suttas, unless they're referring to the cessation or the attainment of cessation, Nirodha Samapati, as enlightenment itself. And again, this could be a case of um, like an early description of enlightenment just getting turned into like an advanced but still not fully enlightened state. And I'm not sure if I answered that question at all. But fortunately for Siovac and Sipat Zidana, he asked a number of questions, and so hopefully I'll competently and successfully answer at least one of them. And his next question is, and I assume it's a he because, as I say, 97% of all of my viewers are male. And anyway, he says, it seems the consciousness ceasing part is also described many times in the Parayana Vaga, and the Buddha was asked specifically by the Brahmin about the two popular interpretations Theravada Buddhists have of Parinibbana even today. If they were to remain there, okay, so that's his sort of prologue, I guess, and then he's quoting some suttas here, or they're puchas in the Parayana Vaga. They're questions. There were these young Brahmins who came to the Buddha and asked him these philosophical questions, and then he answered them, and that's what the Parayana Vaga consists of mainly. So anyway, one of them says, if they were to remain there without traveling on, even for myriad years, all seer, and being freed or to grow cool right there, would the consciousness of such a one pass away? And then the Buddha says, as a flame tossed by a gust of wind, replied the Buddha, comes to an end beyond reckoning, so too a sage freed from mental phenomena comes to an end beyond reckoning. And see, one who has come to an end, do they not exist? Or do they exist in a state of eternal wellness? Please, sage, answer me clearly, for truly you understand this matter. And then the Buddha says, one who has come to an end cannot be defined, replied the Buddha. They have nothing by which one might describe them, when all things have been eradicated too are all ways of speech. And then Siovac and Sipat Zidana ask, what are your thoughts on this? Well, there's just one thing that came up. It's very it's kind of a famous statement here that as a flame tossed by a gust of wind comes to an end beyond reckoning, so too a sage freed from mental phenomena comes to an end beyond reckoning. Yeah, I think my translation is something as a flame tossed by the force of wind. Comes to its cessation and does not subject itself to any designation. So to a sage freed from, and its namakaya is what is described here as mental phenomenon. Namakaya is like the mass of names. A sage freed from the mass of names comes to a cessation and no longer subjects himself to any designation. And that's the flame tossed by a gust of wind, and that's like the wind blowing out. And that's nirvana. Literally, nirvana means blowing out, even though you've got other people saying it means all these other things. It's pretty obviously, literally, nirvana means blowing out. Vayadi is to blow. Nir means out. So, I mean, it may have been influenced by other words. You know, English is kind of like that too sometimes. But let's see. What are my thoughts on this, though? Really, I mean, it's fairly straightforward, even though it's hard to grasp, because I mean, it's talking about ungraspability. You know, once you've gone off the scale, no words will describe it. It's kind of what I was talking about earlier with regard to the Vedantists who are, you know, giving a name to Brahman and referring to it as an it and everything. And the Buddhists, I mean, you have to give ultimate reality or the absolute, you know, the highest state or whatever. You have to give it some kind of name. And otherwise, I mean, you might just be oblivious. You know, it's sort of a catch-22. But whatever name you give to it, that is not it. Any concept in your head, that is not it. So, I mean, it's in a way, it's futile. Let's see, but I'm not exactly sure what the question is here. Maybe I should back up here, because I really do want to answer at least one of his questions. Let's see. The consciousness ceasing part is also described many times in the Parayana, and the Buddha was asked specifically by the Brahmin about the two popular interpretations Theravada Buddhists have of Parinibbana even today. Yeah, Parinibbana is the nirvana after an enlightened being dies. So they attain nirvana while they're still alive, usually, or at the very moment of death. And then parinibbana is like after they die, you know. So there has been a certain amount of controversy, especially in very early Buddhism, that are you fully enlightened even before you die, or you're not fully, attain to nirvana until after you die, and then all of the five khandhas disappear, the breakup of the body and the mind and all that. And the Buddha is just saying, I mean, you don't even go there. I mean, trying to pinpoint and understand intellectually this stuff, it just doesn't work. It's just futile. So I guess those are my thoughts on this. So I'll just move on to Co Vaksha and Sipat Zidana's next question. In the Mahatana Sankhya Sutta, a monk claims that, quote, it is the same consciousness that runs and wanders through the round of rebirths, not another. It is this same consciousness that runs and wanders through the round of rebirths, not another, unquote. Thus, Buddha then replies, quote, silly man, who on earth have you ever known me to teach in that way? Haven't I said in many ways that consciousness is dependently originated, since consciousness does not arise without a cause? But still you misrepresent me by your wrong grasp, harm yourself, and make much bad karma. This will be for your lasting harm and suffering, unquote. Based on this, doesn't this go against the Yogacara view that only consciousness exists? Well, I mean, I'm not an expert on Yogacara Buddhism, which is one of the two main philosophical schools of Mahayana, the two main earliest ones anyway, the consciousness only school. And I mean, it doesn't necessarily go against the Yogacara view that only consciousness exists, because consciousness, I mean, it could still be consciousness of something. That's one of the main things that is taught in Theravada, is that you can't have consciousness unless it's consciousness of something. You have to have a mental state with the consciousness. You have to have a conscious mental state. You can't have the consciousness all by itself. You can't have the mental state all by itself. You have to have consciousness and a mental state. And Abhidhamma really can't deal with it very well, in my opinion. I think that the consciousness is just like the substance, the essence of the mental state. The mental state itself is the form. It's just waves or ripples, with consciousness itself being the water. But let's see here. The Buddha says, haven't I said in many ways that consciousness is dependently originated, since consciousness does not arise without a cause? Well, I mean, there are at least two suttas containing very old fragments of older suttas, I think, that didn't make it into the Tipitaka, that describe nibbana or nirvana as infinite formless consciousness. But the thing is, anything that's infinite and formless becomes paradoxical. I mean, if it's infinite and formless, I mean, it's everything and zero at the same time. I mean, you can't grasp it. There's nothing that can be perceived about it because it has no form. So it becomes like paradoxical. And I really do think that's a good way of describing how enlightenment works. Is, you got the consciousness, and you're trying to just be at the level of pure consciousness. The mental states are irrelevant. But I mean, if you attain to a state of just pure consciousness, then it becomes like this paradoxical state, and you're not in samsara anymore. So it's really hard to explain ultimate reality in words. In fact, it is utterly impossible to explain ultimate reality in words. So the best thing you can do is just talk in weird riddles like Zen masters, or neti of the Upanishads, or like in early Buddhism, where you just kind of dance around nirvana as much as you can and not reify it any more than you absolutely have to. So I guess I'll just move on to Co Vaksha and Sipat Zidana's next question. And I really do hope I answer at least one of these to his satisfaction. Also, why would you disagree with the Majamaka idea that neither the mind nor matter really exists, since you say maybe only consciousness exists? Well, I pretty much answered that. Is that um, if you call consciousness ultimate reality, then I mean, it has to be consciousness of something for it to have any meaningful existence in samsara. You get rid of that of something, and again, it just becomes indistinguishable from void. It just becomes emptiness itself. It's like, I've said this before, that as a general rule, I've got no use for Hegel as a philosopher. I mean, he's done more harm than good, I think. But the beginning of his logic, the beginning of his logical dialectic really is profound, and I like it very much. He starts off with pure being, and then the antithesis to pure being is pure non-being. And then he points out that pure being and pure non-being are so utterly devoid of any discrete content that they are indistinguishable. They just merge into each other, and they're identical. And I mean, he uses that just as a kind of what is it? Not a postulate, but what's like a theorem or something, just throughout the rest of his philosophy, that everything and nothing ultimately are the same, which is really elegant because it explains how the universe arose. But the thing is, you've got pure being as the thesis, pure non-being as the antithesis. Then you've got the synthesis, which is like the contrast between being and non-being. And from this contrast, all the 10,000 things of samsara arise. Like in the Tao Te Ching, it's like from the Tao came the one, from the one came the two, from the two came the 10,000 things. I think I think that's a good quote. I think I remember it saying that. So yeah, so I think I've already answered that. Why would you disagree with the Majamaka idea that neither the mind nor matter really exists, since you say maybe only consciousness exists? Yeah, but once the consciousness becomes infinite and formless, then all bets are off. You know, it becomes identical to emptiness. It becomes this paradox. So I'll just move on to Siovaksha and Sipad Zidana's next question. Can you explain the idea of sampajanya and how it is related to sati? Yeah, in the text, there's a lot of talk about sati sampajanya, and sati is mindfulness. Sampajanya usually it's translated as something like clear awareness or full awareness. Like janya is knowledge, gnosis. Janya is knowledge. Pajanya is like, well, I want to say prognosis. I mean, that's it would be literally what it would be in Greek, for going back to with the same Indo-European etymology and all. But it's like an intensifier, and sampajanya is even more of it. So you got two intensifiers added to the word that means knowledge. And if you read the texts, like the Satipatthana Sutta, where it's talking about sati sampajanya, sati is the four foundations of mindfulness, which does include mindfulness of the body, but the pajanya part, when it's defining that or describing it, it's talking about, you know, when you turn your head, you know you're turning your head. You know, when you stretch out your arm, you know you're stretching it out. When you retract your arm, you know you're retracting it. It's like you're just fully aware of whatever's going on. Whereas with sati, it's more of a focused, deliberate thing. Whereas with the sampajanya, it's just you're just like wide open, fully aware of whatever is going on, especially with regard to like your own bodily processes and so forth. But sampajanya usually is just telescoped into sati. So it's like an aspect of sati, or there's it may be that they were originally different, but usually nowadays, especially, or even in Pali text, when it's talking about sati, it's like sampajanya is like included into that. But early Theravada Buddhism was sort of pre-logical, like formal logic hadn't arrived in India yet, or hadn't developed in India yet. There was no Indian Aristotle at the time, and some of the classification schemes really do not make good logical sense. And so you can have like a list that has one general thing, and then you've got a couple of specific, aspects of that general thing on the same list, which I've never really liked that aspect of Theravada, but you can't really blame them because they were products of their age. And as I say, India just had not developed or imported formal logic yet. So I think I'll just move on to Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana's next question, which is, in the older suttas like the Parayana Vaga, it seems the word used more was Lord of Death and referred to Yama, and that enlightenment was referred to as escaping the Lord of Death, or Yama, rather than escaping Mara. However, Mara also literally means death. Do you think Mara as an entity was a later addition or had some different role in the Buddhist time, or is there some other explanation for this? Yeah, it is true in the oldest text, it does refer to the Lord of Death. Um, in the Atthaka Vaga as well as the Parayana Vaga, it refers to the Lord of Death. I don't think it mentions Mara by name. It may be that Mara was a later development. I don't know what the origin of Mara is. Um, so I don't know if there was like a pre-Buddhist Vedic tradition that already had Mara that was just incorporated into Buddhist cosmology, or whether Mara was just invented as sort of the Buddhist cosmic bad guy, sort of like Satan was invented by um, relatively late Hebrews. It's interesting. If you read the Old Testament, there's only 3 books that mention Satan at all. One, of course, is the book of Job, where Satan is just kind of like a servant of God. He really can't go against God's wishes. And then there's just a few like um, like Babylonian captivity, like late minor prophets that mention Mara. Or I think it's in the book of Chronicles. There's a mention of Mara, or not Mara, but Satan. So it could be that Buddhism kind of developed Mara relatively early on, because obviously he's in core texts of the suttas, but he's not, as far as I know, in the oldest strata of the Pali texts. And so it could be that he's just a derivative of Yama, although Yama is usually like in the Upanishads. Yama is sort of like a righteous, he's a righteous judge of the dead. Whereas maybe it was that Yama had too good of a reputation, so they needed something more diabolical, or some kind of tempter. But again, the origin of Mara, I really don't know. It is interesting that there is a sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya, the Mara Tajaniya Sutta, in which Kali is mentioned as a relative of Mara. But because, I mean, Kali didn't really become like a cosmic deity with like a positive side until early modern times. Like I think it was in Bengal that Kali started having this cosmic sort of like a good aspect. But Kali before that was just a kind of demoness that haunted battlefields and graveyards and so forth. And it may be that that Mara also just had some early, like in the Ganges Valley in the Buddhist time, was just some sort of spook or demon or something that just got incorporated into Buddhist cosmology. I'm not aware of Mara being mentioned in any Hindu text that I can recall. So, yeah, I think Mara might be a later addition or just sort of a modification, just like Saka, King of Gods, is a modification of Indra, who was the patron deity of the Indo-Aryans. So, man, CO Vaksha and Sipad Zidana is asking some tough ones. I do hope I'll answer at least one of them satisfactorily. And here is CO Vaksha and Sipad Zidana's next and last question, which is, why do you think the Mahasangika and Stavira Vada broke apart historically? I have read conflicting stories where the Mahayana claim it happened in the Second Council and the Stavira wanted to add new rules. Meanwhile, the Theravada claims the Mahasanghika wanted to remove rules and that the actual split happened decades after the Second Council, with the points of Mahadeva denigrating the status of an arahant and making the Buddha into a godlike being. Yeah, this is another one of those cases where the evidence is not just clear cut. That there is mention of the Second Council not only in Theravada texts but even the other side, like the Mahasanghika schools, had their version of the Second Council, and they agreed that it was mainly with regard to um, Vinaya rules, monastic discipline, and that the Stavira side won the debate. That I'm pretty sure that even the other side admits that at the Second Council, it was the Stavira side, the Proto-Terras, that actually won the debate with regard to, according to the Theravada version, it was a list of these things. Number one being, is it allowable for monks to handle money? Because some of the monks in the East had started handling money, and the stricter monks in the West weren't handling it, and they were calling out the monks that were handling it, which caused this kind of an argument. And so they had this great council to settle the issue. And there was a bunch of other things too, like is a monk allowed to carry salt to season his food, and can he use a sitting cloth that doesn't have like a border on it, a border sewn onto it? And there's a bunch of other things. Should you follow the teachings of your teacher, no matter what? And the correct answer on that was, well, sometimes. I mean, if he's saying correct dharma, then you should follow what he says, and if he's not saying correct dharma, you shouldn't follow what he says. With regard to the salt one, you're not allowed to carry salt for seasoning food, although a monk is allowed to keep salt for as long as he wants for medicinal purposes. Like mix it with water to, you've got like a cut on your finger, you want to, what is it? Trying to get a sliver to fester out or something. I don't know. I used to know this guy who was a meat cutter, and I noticed I'm all of a sudden blurry. Yeah, still blurry. There we go. And yeah, he'd if he'd cut himself, he'd have his fingers sticking in salt water for a while. But I'm completely going off the track here. But they say that the schism didn't happen right at the Second Council. It wasn't like the Mahasangha side says, no, we're just going to handle money from now on and screw you guys. It was like, it kind of worked with regard to the rules of monastic discipline. Then a few decades later, maybe 20 or 30 years later, then the split occurred, the schism, the first major schism in ancient Buddhism. And according to the Mahayana side or the Mahasanghika side, it was over philosophical points. Like one of the main ones was, can an arahant backslide and become unenlightened? Or is an arahant capable of having nocturnal emissions in his sleep? Is he able to ejaculate in a dream in his sleep? This kind of thing. And with regard to making the Buddha into a godlike being, that may have been part of it, because it was the Mahasangha side that really took the ball and ran with it with regard to devotionalism and just glorifying the Buddha into essentially God. So yeah, it's really uncertain because there's not a whole lot of documented evidence, and of course archaeology. I mean, they can't do much. Scientists can't work it out. So that's sort of the best. I think the best guess people can make is that there was like a controversy over monastic discipline that caused the Second Council, that the Western monks, like the Proto-Theravada schools, they won the debate. The Mahasangha schools admitted, okay, we'll stop handling money or whatever. And then just maybe a few decades later, possibly totally unrelated to the Second Council, you had Mahasangha philosophers who were coming up with these new ideas and saying, that a Buddha or even maybe a bodhisattva, probably just a Buddha, is like way above the level of an arhat. The Terras, they eventually kind of agreed with it, but they didn't go as far as the Mahasangha did. And so, yeah, I mean, the Mahayana schools obviously consider arhats to be just sort of an inferior kind of enlightened being, if they're even considered to be fully enlightened or not. So, yeah, it's really hard to say exactly. I'm sure there's all kinds of scholarly stuff written on the subject, although most of it tends to be written by academics who really don't have much of an appreciation of the finer points of Dharma. But that's about the best guess I could make ever. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from SS. And SS says, have you read Ananda Kumara Swami's Hinduism and Buddhism? Would you endorse his thesis that early Buddhism was essentially non-different from Vedanta? Well, I haven't read the book. I have read like articles by Ananda Kumara Swami, and I've read um, a few books written by Hindus about Buddhism and like comparing Buddhism to Hinduism. And one thing I've noticed is that Hindus will always try to interpret Buddhism along Hindu lines. Like even one of the most important books I've ever read on the subject of Buddhism, it's on the bookshelf back there, Studies in the Origins of Buddhism by G.C. Pandey, who was a high caste Brahmin and a Hindu. Um, he was he would always interpret like the higher points of Buddhism along Vedantist lines. And if you've been a Hindu your whole life, especially if you're like a Brahmin who is like just steeped in this, you've been studying this stuff, you're going to see everything through a Hindu lens. And you look at Buddhism, you're going to be seeing it through Hindu colored glasses. That's not to say that there's not a lot of similarity between Buddhism and Vedanta, because Vedanta and Mahayana Buddhism, especially like Madhyamaka, Vedanta and Madhyamaka, there was a lot of back and forth between them. And I've read that Shankara, who is one of the main philosophers in Advaita Vedanta, I've read that he was strongly influenced by Madhyamaka Buddhism. So it might be the other way, kind of, that Buddhism didn't really borrow or wasn't imitating Vedanta, but to some degree Vedanta was imitating Buddhism. So, yeah, I don't think early Buddhism was essentially non-different from Vedanta, especially because Vedanta is still making assertions, like philosophical, metaphysical assertions, even though they're kind of using a light touch. Whereas early Buddhism, especially the earliest Buddhism, like the Atthakavagga, I mean, it's like you don't make assertions, because any assertion is going to be samsaric and it's not going to come anywhere close to touching reality. So it's just like a kind of mental discipline to cure yourself of beliefs, essentially. Not because early Buddhism was skeptical, but because it was profoundly mystical and they realized that you cannot understand reality by thinking about it. You cannot understand ultimate reality intellectually. You cannot philosophize your way to enlightenment unless you're doing it in kind of a Zen-like way or a Madhyamaka-like way, where you're using your philosophy to just destroy all concepts. And then when you've destroyed everything around you, then it just turns on itself and destroys itself. And then all you've got is just emptiness behind. Emptiness is all that's left. So, I mean, I do think that the Vedantists, like some of the Upanishads and like Shankara, were trying to explain essentially the same reality that Buddhism is trying to non-explain. I mean, I do think that there have been enlightened Hindus, and so their experience and the experience of an enlightened Buddhist, and maybe even the experience of an enlightened contemplative Christian, it's essentially the same, but you're just going to have different ways of explaining it. And because Vedanta and Buddhism both arose in the same general culture, there's going to be more similarity in the explanation. And the ultimate goal is the same. It's just that there's different ways of describing it. So I think I'll just move on to the next question. And this is from Yah, Jah. Is that Jah or Yah? I don't know. Anyway, Jah says, is it possible that when one is perfectly balanced, still, and wide awake in the present moment for long enough, their mindfulness can penetrate reality so deeply that they sort of return back to a more primordial state of pure consciousness or oneness in which any semblance of a body or separate self is temporarily gone? And this could seem like a trance to some, but it's actually proper samadhi. And in this case, then many people could mistaken could mistake actual trances for jhana when they're actually not in proper samadhi or sama samadhi. I think it's possible that one's mindfulness can penetrate reality so deeply that it actually enters into more subtle, refined realms or states in which physicality seems to dematerialize, and these states truly can seem transcendent of this realm we are in. And I think it's also possible and fairly common for one to enter a sort of self-induced hypnagogic trance state where mindfulness is not present and hallucinations are common, and that should definitely not be mistaken for jhana or sama samadhi, but maybe it can be hard to tell the difference sometimes for some, question mark, just a thought. Yeah, I pretty much agree with this, that some people, um, they can just get into like this transcendental state where they, in a way, they kind of leave their body behind, or their body just becomes irrelevant. You know, um, either they're just not focused on it anymore. It's just in a way they kind of leave it behind, or it's just it's just such a crude vibration compared with the fineness or the subtlety of the vibration that they are in, that it just becomes like background noise. It's still there. I mean, it's like the energy of it and everything, but it's just that they're so much more aware of other things that their body becomes way less important than it was. And then some people just hypnotize themselves into a trance, and if you're in a hypnotic state, I mean, you can experience just about anything imaginable. You know, any kind of perceptual state, you can induce that through hypnosis. So let's see here. What is the actual question here? Is it possible that when one is perfectly balanced, still and wide awake in the present moment for long enough, their mindfulness can penetrate reality so deeply that they sort of return back to a more primordial state of pure consciousness, oneness, which any semblance of body separate self is temporarily gone? Well, I do not. I'm not a materialist, so I don't think that the physical plane, the physical body, or the physical world is even ultimately real. So if you get into a, a state that's closer to ultimate reality, then I mean, this stuff can just start fading out. It's sort of like if you're in a dream and you start waking up, then the dream kind of starts fading out. It could be a state like that also. So yeah, I pretty much agree with Ja or Ya here. Um, let's see. And then there's one other question mark here, but maybe it can be hard to tell the difference sometimes for some. Yeah, a lot of people just get very confused, partly because they don't have a teacher, or partly because their teacher is just not very advanced and doesn't know how to deal with some of the stuff that they're experiencing. You know, some teachers, especially in Asia, they're just pretty much just they've just memorized from a book or what their teacher taught them, and then just parroting it to somebody else, and they can't really deal with like strange problems in meditation because they don't have the experience to do it. Well, even worse than that is if you're just on your own and you have these experiences. If I mean, if you're wise, then you just let it go, no matter what it is. Don't attribute significance to it. Just let it go, let it go, let it go. Even Saint John of the Cross, who was a Catholic mystic, would tell his students, his contemplation students, it doesn't matter what it is. You might hear the voice of God, you might see Jesus Christ standing in front of you. Just let it go, let it go, let it go, because even the devil can appear in the form of an angel of light or some such. So just let it all go, and don't attribute significance to it. And that is the wisest approach. And it's like armor. It prevents you from being led astray by weird meditative experiences. So I'll just move on to the next question here. And this is from Crazy Librarian. And Crazy Librarian says, what personality change did you notice from before you were a monk, as a monk, and after disrobing? That's kind of an interesting question. And it's, to some degree, it could be like a trick question because, um, I mean, you could say, what are the changes from before I was a monk, as a monk, and after disrobing? But I mean, it could just essentially mean what were my personality changes when I was young, when I was like, no longer so young, and then now that I'm like an old guy with white hair. Um, so it's hard to say, what changes were caused by my being a monk and what changes were caused by me just gradually getting older. But before I was a monk, gosh, let's see, what are the main differences? Well, I wasn't as introspective. I mean, I was always kind of an introvert, but I wasn't as mindful. Didn't have as good of concentration as after I became a monk and was like practicing mindfulness and concentration like professionally, so to speak. Um, and I got fairly chilled out. I mean, it wasn't easy. It doesn't come naturally to me. You may recall one of the 10 fetters mentioned above is udacha, or mental agitation, or just restlessness. And I've got a very restless mind, and so it took really just grueling effort to really get my mind clear as a meditator. I had to live alone in caves, in forests, and just go for it full blast in order for that to really work for me. But it did work. So I mean, there was that. I've got a lot more perspective. I'm less. I see the big picture a little better now. I'm not as identified with the meat puppet. I mean, that was something that happened. After I was a monk, became less afraid of death. But the difference between, before I was a monk and while I was a monk are probably greater than the difference while I was a monk to now, when I'm no longer a monk again. Um, I think the main difference from when I was a monk to now is largely, like I keep saying, that I have to dedicate a lot of time and energy just to navigating samsara, just, working for a living, working full time to pay bills, that kind of a thing. So I'm more, I have to engage more in samsara and spend a lot more time just thinking about, getting the bills paid, mowing the lawn and so forth, and not so much about, finer aspects of dharma. Um, Also, after disrobing, because I'm working full time, I'm no longer a member of the leisure class. So I have less energy. It's like my vitality feels less, even though it's probably not so different. It's just that when I wasn't having to work for a living, you can just sit around all day. And so I wasn't in as good of shape, I suppose, and my skin wasn't as good, for various reasons. Just I don't, I won't even go there. But now what was I gonna say? Oh yeah, it's like I just had this extra energy because I didn't have to expend it like working full time and just in navigating samsara, interacting with all these different people in these different situations and so forth. I mean, even a monk has to interact with other people and navigate samsara to some degree, but it's detached and more subtle. It's simpler. So I mean, that's the main difference from when I was a monk to now. Is Mainly I just have to dedicate so much more time and energy just to navigating samsara and getting the bills paid and so forth. So I don't know how well I answered that question. There's probably important things that I'm just overlooking and not thinking of right now. So I'll just move on to the next question, also by Crazy Librarian, which is this: Moggallana was killed ruthlessly, and killing an arahant was an anandarika karma. Anandarika Kama, but Moggallana also wasn't able to avoid being killed. Do his killers receive life in Avicii hell for killing him? If so, what could they do to avoid killing Moggallana, as Moggallana was also fated to die ruthlessly from having Anantarika Kama in the past. So Anantarika Kama, if I remember correctly, it's a kind of karma that just guarantees you're going to go to hell right after you die. Essentially the ground's just going to open up and swallow you. You're going to fall down into the lowest pits of hell. And killing an enlightened being is one of those acts that is a guarantee of hell. And Mahamoggallana, who was one of the Buddha's two chief disciples, he and Sariputta were the two chief disciples. He was murdered. He was essentially beaten to a pulp, just literally. According to the texts, he did not have an unbroken bone left in his body after this group of non-Buddhist philosophers, or I think it was just some hitmen hired by some disgruntled non-Buddhist philosophers. The competition. And according to the story, when they came after him, the first two times he was a master of psychic powers. Of all the Buddha's great disciples, he was the one who had mastered psychic powers the best. And so he could just like fly away. He could just poof out. He could just disappear in one place and appear, 100 yards away or 100 miles away or whatever. But finally, after the second time, he realized that he had the karma to have this done, and so the third time, he just didn't run away and let them kill him. But that's on them. Killing him is still on them. You can't really say that, if you punch somebody in the nose, it's their karma to get punched in the nose, and therefore you're off the hook, because they're paying off their old karma, but you're making new karma. And so Moggallana may have had the karma to get killed, but if it wasn't these guys, it would be somebody else. And so, if these guys just didn't want to do it, they had a change of heart or whatever, then something else would have come along to accomplish the same thing. So, yeah, you can't really blame the victim as a way of justifying screwing them over or hurting them or whatever. It is true, if someone is murdered, it's their karma to get murdered, regardless of whether they're an arahant or not. But the person who kills them is making brand new karma by killing them. That's his volitional act, his volition. He's still got the hate, he's still got the ill will, he's still, making this effort to hurt and mess up and kill another person. So that's on the person who's doing it, even if it's the karma of the person to get killed. It applies not just to Moggallana, but to just anybody. Some teenage prostitute in a back alley in New York City. It's the same essential thing. And it might be her karma to get killed, but still the murderer is making some seriously bad karma by doing it. So I'll just move on to Crazy Librarian's next question, which is Angulimala, an arahant who also got hit a lot when he did alms bowl, alms round, which is pretty justified given what he did. Do these people, including children who hit him until he bleeds, get a huge amount of bad karma and got sent to hell for next life? I feel this is totally not fair, even if Angulimala is an arahant. So Angulimala, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the name, he was a serial killer. Anguli means finger, and mala means necklace. It's like a garland. So he was a serial killer who would, after he'd kill somebody, he'd cut off a finger and put it on this garland of fingers. He had this garland of fingers around his neck. And I think it was Richard Gombrich wrote this book, How Buddhism Began, the conditioned genesis of the early teachings or something like that. And he had this entire chapter on, was Angulimala a worshiper of Kali? That he wasn't just some serial killer, that he had some sort of religious reason for doing this. And the Buddha converted him to Buddhism through some psychic powers. Like Angulimala is chasing after him. Well, at first he was going to murder his own mother. He was so far gone, according to the story. The Buddha saw this, intervened. He kind of went in between Angulimala and his mother to kind of distract him. And then Angulimala starts chasing after the Buddha. And although Angulimala is running as fast as he can, and the Buddha is just walking at a leisurely pace, he can't keep up with him. He can't catch him. and then he realizes, this is weird. This is like supernatural or super normal or something, and sort of broke down this hardened shell around his mind or around his heart, and then the Buddha was able to teach him something, which is a method that Neem Karoli Baba would do also. He would do something supernatural, super normal. He'd perform some miracle which would completely blow the mind of the person that he was talking to, that would just sort of like make them vulnerable, and then he could just kind of reach in and say the right thing that would is exactly what they needed to hear. But they had to have their mind blown first so that they could become receptive. Anyway, that's not the question. Crazy Librarian is asking, is the people that hit him when he went for alms round, because he was like this notorious serial killer, and then he gets converted to Buddhism, and then he becomes a monk. I think, if I remember correctly, by the permission of the king. The king said, "All right, he's converted to Buddhism. He's like a peaceful monk now. All right, we'll spare him. We won't have him executed in nasty ways." So then when Angulimala would walk for alms, like monks are supposed to do, walking through the village with his bowl, some people would be like spitting on him and hitting him and stuff. Um, I would imagine that the kids that weren't really ripe for hell wouldn't hit him hard enough that he'd start bleeding. Yeah, because that's another one of the things. Well, actually, yeah, I mean, just making an arahant bleed isn't a guarantee of hell. Is making a Buddha bleed. That's another one of the anandarika karmas, that if you do this, you're guaranteed of hell. Making a Buddha bleed, or killing an ordinary arahant. And so, I mean, just that kind of makes it kind of suspicious that it's probably an artifact of later tradition, when the difference between a Buddha and an ordinary enlightened being had been, widened. But yeah, people that hated him and were hitting him and stuff, they did get some bad karma for it. But yeah, if they weren't really bad people, maybe he like killed their uncle or something, and they smacked him, or put gross rotten food in his bowl or something. I mean, they'd be getting bad karma for it, but I don't think they'd be going to the lowest pits of hell. So we'll just move on to Crazy Librarian's next question, which is, hell beings are often portrayed dealing heavy and inhuman punishment to people who are reborn in hell. Do they reap bad karmas from this? Well, this is kind of an interesting question, because I have been told by a German monk who lived in southern Burma back when I lived in central Burma that according to Orthodox tradition, the demons in hell are just like, there's nobody there. They're like they're almost like holograms. They're like robots or something. They're like fake beings that are just created by the force of the karma of the people in hell, and so they don't have any volitions. In a way that, ironically, they're almost like enlightened beings, because they're not making any karma. They don't have any bad mental states or good mental states either. It's just sort of like this projection created by the karma of the people in hell. And unfortunately, I've been told that the celestial nymphs, like the harems of minor goddesses that the gods have in the lower heaven realms, are similar. But assuming that there are demons that really are genuine conscious beings in the lower realms, and I assume there really are demonic beings in this universe, that yeah, they're making really bad karma. Yeah, they're messing themselves up and just keeping themselves in hell. If they just kind of wandered off and refused to torture people, they might get out of hell easier. But as it is, they're down there for gajillions of years. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from AVSTR. And AVSTR says, "Hi, regarding the alms rounds, is there any rule that says you have to eat everything that is offered to you? Obviously, like you said, once you are full, you can give the rest to animals, etc. But are you allowed to deliberately not eat something? Like in Cambodia, where they eat fried spiders, that is probably one of the few things I could never bring myself to even try. No, you have to accept what people are offering, assuming that they're offering food in good faith. If they're trying to put a dog turd or something in your bowl because they just don't like you, you don't have to accept that. Or if they're trying to offer you something that just isn't allowable, like money, you don't have to accept that. But if someone in good faith is offering food, even if it's food that you hate, yeah, you have to accept it. You're not allowed to make faces or anything. You're not allowed to like anything like that. You just accept it respectfully, but you're not required to eat it. Like there are some monks who are vegetarian, and even though they get meat in their bowl, some of them, that I mean, they're not required to eat the meat. You can just move it over to one side and just eat what you want to eat. I mean, I did that even at my strictest. Sometimes, I mean, you just take all the food and you just stir it together into a glop. And I did that as a regular practice up until the banana man came along. And there was this guy, he'd offer me like 8 bananas at once. He'd just have this big armload of bananas and he'd give me these bananas. And bananas just don't mix good with other foods. Some food mixes good together. Peanuts, peanuts can mix in with anything. It still tastes fine. But stuff like oranges and bananas, it doesn't mix very good. And so I got to this point where I just mixed some of the bananas in and just as a way of not being totally grossed out by this banana flavored food every day. Um, but yeah, I mean, the easy answer to this is no. You're not required. You're required to accept it, but you're not required to eat it. So, with regard to fried spiders, and fortunately, nobody gave me fried spiders. Somebody gave me fried cicadas a few times, which I just didn't eat. And I've gotten other things, bee larvae. I've eaten fried bee larvae, some kind of water bug called a dwinpo in Burma. I ate lots of those. Lizard tails, frog eggs, all kinds of things. But you're not required to eat it. It is kind of a good practice just to eat whatever you're given. In fact, like not just me when I was a young monk, but I think the followers of Ajahn Mahabua just stir everything together into this just glop and then just eat it that way, just without discrimination. They just eat it. Because you're not supposed to eat it for pleasure. You're not supposed to eat it to have a good time. You're just supposed to eat it so that it will keep you healthy enough to continue practicing. So the next question is from Stevie. I'm looking at the time. We're at an hour and 22 minutes now. Stevie says, I have Crohn's disease, which requires me to take daily medication. Does having this condition and needing daily medication prevent me from ordaining? Based on my research, I don't think I'd be allowed to ordain because I'd be a burden on others. Can you provide any guidance on this? Well, maybe I should have looked it up before I did this video, but I'm not exactly sure what Crohn's disease is. I mean, if it's a disease, I don't think it's a disease of like skin eruptions. Like there are certain diseases where you're not supposed to be ordained, but like epilepsy or leprosy, there's a few of them like that where if you have the disease, you're not supposed to be ordained because according to the story, people with these diseases were being ordained as monks just so they could get cured by the Buddha's like super good doctor Jivaka. Jivaka was the Buddha's personal physician. He was the personal physician to the early Sangha when there weren't lots and lots of them. And so um, people started being ordained with these diseases like leprosy in order to get cured by Jivaka. So it became against the rules. But even though it's against the rules to ordain somebody with one of these diseases, even the ones on the list that are specified, the ordination is still valid. The monks who did the ordination get a minor offense. They got to confess it, but still the ordination is considered valid. So, I mean, you could technically be ordained, or Stevie could here. I've read about one monk in the Ajahn Chah tradition, a relatively senior monk, who had to leave Asia because he had Crohn's disease. That he had to live in the West, where where medicine was more available and so forth. Um, So, yeah, I mean, technically you could, although you would have to make arrangements, I think, that somebody would be willing to offer you the medicine that you require. I don't know how often or expensive this medicine is for Crohn's disease. Um, I'm not even sure what Crohn's disease is, but technically, I think you could be allowed to be ordained. It would depend on the sangha. If they didn't want to, if it's a poor monastery and they don't want to be, burdened with the expense or something, they might not be willing to ordain you. I don't think you'd want to be ordained in some remote area of Upper Burma or something. But if there's somebody who's like willing to sponsor you and support you with the whatever medicine you need, and they can afford it, and it's no problem for them, and they're happy to do it because they want to gather up treasures in heaven and so forth, then I think you could still do it. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Francois, or as people with this name are known in America, Francois. And Francois says, would you consider being a bhikkhu again if your present circumstances change drastically, of course, or is it out of the question? Thanks. Yeah, I'm not going to be a monk again. I got as far as I could with it, and I think if I became a monk again, it would be sort of cheating, partly just because I'd be getting old and just sort of be using the sangha as a kind of retirement home or something. I mean, that's a common practice in Southeast Asia, but yeah, I don't think so. I do not think so. So I think that was kind of an easy one, as an easy question anyway. So the next question is from Der Vegane Skeptiker, which I think means the vegan skeptic in German. And the vegan skeptic says, have you ever studied the life of Mahavira? What are the similarities and differences between Buddhism and Jainism? Um, I read some Jain sutras a long time ago. I think they were the ones that were in Max Muller's Sacred Books of the East series. And one of the suttas that was essentially just the story of Mahavira. And it was almost exactly the same as the story of Gautama Buddha. And I did a video, a Q&A relatively recently, where I was trying to explain how it is that the renunciation of story of Mahavira and the renunciation story of Gautama Buddha were so similar. And I do think that the Jains, because they lost their sutras twice, they lost their body of literature twice because it was the tradition in India to memorize it, and the Jains were just hardcore ascetics. They were busy torturing themselves out in the jungle somewhere, and the ones that memorized the texts just kind of died out. And so they had to have like two more or less emergency councils to sort of come up with, salvage as much as they could of like a corpus of Jain texts. So the life of Mahavira as it's recorded in the Jain scriptures is not necessarily reliable because I think a lot of it was just borrowed or plagiarized from the story of the Buddha. So yeah, uh, I mean he was definitely much more of an ascetic than the Buddha was. I mean, at least after his enlightenment, supposedly he remained a hardcore ascetic, whereas the Buddha experimented with hardcore asceticism. Just as much as Mahavira, just traveling, wandering around naked and just eating cow poop or just eating once a week. Kind of this kind of just. I mean, he was just like emaciated, like this scarecrow or something. And in the Buddha's case, he realized finally that this ancient Indian tradition of just torturing yourself almost to death wasn't working. It wasn't getting him enlightened. And so then he found the middle path between self-torture and self-indulgence. Whereas Mahavira pretty much just stayed on the self-torture side. And that's what Jainism really teaches, is that you do have a soul in Jainism. It's called the jiva, which in Buddhism you don't have a soul or a jiva. Um, but in Jainism you do. And your karma is almost a material substance that sticks to your soul and weighs you down so that your soul just can't float up into heaven and live in eternal bliss. And I do think that this belief goes all the way back to the prehistoric Indus Valley civilization, because there are a number of different schools that were in the Shramana lineage or Shramana tradition that predated the Vedic Indo-Aryans coming into India. And so they believe that you have, that's what the whole philosophy of Jainism or the whole practice of Jainism is about, is you do not want to make any new karma, and you've got to get rid of all of your old karma. And so, I mean, and this karma is, I mean, you can do it without intention. Unlike Buddhism, where karma is intention, in Jainism, even if you step on a bug accidentally, you're making bad karma for it. Or, you know, even if you do something completely unintentionally, you can still be making bad karma. So they just are like radically passive. You know, they got like the soft grass broom and they sweep the ground in front of them so they won't accidentally step on bugs. And there's this weird sutra that I still remember, that it was back when I was reading these Jain sutras when I was in college. Um, it's like if a Jain monk wants to cross a river and there's no bridge, he can go in a boat, but only if the boat was going to cross the river anyway. If they cross the river just for him, just to take him across as a favor, he's making karma. So he's got to just go along for the ride if it was already going there anyway. And then if the boat starts to sink halfway across the river, he's not allowed to help bail it out because that's making karma. So what happens, what he's supposed to do, according to this Jain Sutra, is if he's going across the river, the boat starts to sink, he's supposed to take off all of his clothes if he's got any, because a lot of them just went around naked, and fold them and put them onto his head so that if the boat owner gets angry at him and throws him overboard, his clothes won't get wet. And also, I'm pretty sure it was the Ajivakas did this. I think the Jains did it also. Once you figured you'd gotten rid of all of your karma, you're supposed to just wander off into this desolate area, this uninhabited area, and just squat down and just stay squatting there until you died, probably of kidney failure. So there are some considerable differences between Buddhism and Jainism. One kind of minor one is that a Tirthankara, or an enlightened, like the Jainist equivalent of a Buddha, he's completely omniscient. He supposedly knows all things at all times. You know, he's got infinite knowledge in his mind all the time. Whereas in Buddhism, the Buddha had a kind of qualified omniscience where he could know anything he wanted to know, but you know, he had to attend to it in order for the knowledge to come up, so to speak. So Buddhism and Jainism have roots going back into the Shramana tradition of like ancient northwestern India, ancient northern India. But the Buddha was more innovative, and Mahavira, I think, he went with a more traditional approach within the context of the Shramanic tradition. And the Jains were really just radical ascetics, whereas you know, they kind of look down their noses at the Buddhists as the kind of shaven-headed householders. You know, Buddhists get to wear shoes. You know, they get to use walking sticks. So they just sneered at them. So I'll just move on to the next question here. And this is from Ludovic Balam. And this is a difficult one. And Ludovic Balam says, would it be fair to say that logics are provisional to enlightenment, such that a discernment could be made, but not necessarily posited? Which comes first, the sutra or the philosophical underpinnings? And I really didn't understand this. His reading level is way above mine, apparently. So I asked him if he could clarify, and then he says, is saying nirvana needs to be discerned, ignoring the reality of it being and extinguishing, like saying XYZ was provisional for me to become enlightened, but the egg of samsara was what was ripened not the baby chick of enlightenment being refined as a working model. Is there a sense in which the working model, egg or chicken, isn't a guiding light in this context? I imagine it's like a Pratyeka Buddha being asked to learn what samsara and nirvana are. The egg may well be the chicken, but only after it's hatched and lost the shell sort of deal. So tracing it back and saying chicken equals egg or chicken equals slash equals egg or relations between the two as two would be mapping them onto one another when they need to communicate the territory so it's learned and not referenced. And yeah, his writing level is way above my reading level apparently because I mean this is like trying to read Hegel, which I did. I read Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. I was forcing myself to read at least 4 pages a day of it. I have to read it out loud just to keep my mind from wandering away because it was just so dense and abstract. But man, this is it's difficult even to understand this question. Would it be fair to say that logics are provisional to enlightenment such that a discernment could be made but not necessarily posited? Which comes first, the sutra or the philosophical underpinnings? I mean, I just have to guess at even when he clarified, the clarification didn't really make it any clearer to me. So, um, I mean, the philosophical underpinnings are just kind of superfluous. I mean, it's like a map that helps you to get where you're going, but I mean, it's completely just radically different from the goal or even the path. So, gosh, I mean, can any of you guys answer this question? Man, would it be fair to say that logics are provisional to enlightenment such that a discernment could be made but not necessarily posited? Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, I think that's how it's supposed to work. The Atthakavagga is saying that you're not supposed to discern anything really, because once you discern something, you know, you're perceiving something, you're attributing significance to it, and you're ignoring everything else. So, yeah, I mean, it's you just follow the philosophy to the extent that it helps you to practice and maybe helps you to weed out certain bad ideas and so forth. But I mean, you're going for a kind of like quietism or just radical mysticism. It's not really philosophical, other than maybe in the Majamaka sense of using philosophy to just destroy philosophy. Like there's a Mahayana text, I can't remember exactly which one it is. It's the purpose of Lord Buddha's teaching is to liberate us from our thinking by means of our thinking. So yeah, instead of just kind of thrashing about in this question here, not really being sure if I'm answering it or not, I think I'll just move on to Ludovic Balam's next question. And this one is refreshingly easy. Will you be hosting any broadcasted Zoom calls in the future for members of the Discord group like you did that one time? Yeah, it's not Zoom. It's the Discord server has its own video chat room. And we had sort of like a mini one just for moderators just a few days ago. And yeah, it's easily done. Maybe we can do it like next Sunday, which would be probably mid to late afternoon, like maybe 5-ish or 6-ish, going with American Eastern time. Um, yeah, that's definitely doable. I mean, it is kind of nice talking with you guys, like in real life, not just talking to a camera with you guys hearing it later. So I'll just move on to Ludovic Balam's next question. Was there a historical precedence of the siddhi of seeing karma during the life of the Buddha? Could the Buddha, being able to see karma, allow him to convert adepts of his time? Or is it more realistic that he just had greater authority in discourse by virtue of straightforward and penetrating rhetoric? Follow up, is there any historical trace or hiccups or idiosyncrasies of the Buddha that would give him a human face? Well, let's just call that two different questions. I just separated the two. The follow-up will be addressed directly here. So the first question here, was there a historical precedence of the siddhi or power of seeing karma during the life of the Buddha? Could the Buddha, being able to see karma, allow him to convert adepts of his time, or is it more realistic that he just had a greater authority in discourse by virtue of straightforward and penetrating rhetoric? Well, I think there's both. That he was a philosophical genius, I think, but it does say in the text there are rules. There's a Vinaya rule that says a monk is not supposed to do any kind of miracles or like like psychic feats in front of lay people. He can do it in front of other monks, maybe, but he's not supposed to be doing that kind of stuff in front of lay people. But the only psychic feat that he is allowed to do in the presence of lay people is to look into their mind to see how best to teach them. So I guess that's what the Buddha would do, and certainly, like in modern times, Neem Karoli Baba would do that, where he would just look right through you. I mean, he would just meet you for the first time and know you better than you know you. I mean, he would just see right through you. He'd see your past lives. He'd see your karma. He'd just see it all. You know, he'd be working on a different level. So I assume the Buddha would be similar to that. Um, so yeah, I assume he was better than most teachers at producing enlightened disciples, which made him a more successful teacher than Jesus of Nazareth, because I'm not sure if any of Jesus of Nazareth's disciples became extremely advanced. Maybe his brother James, but I digress. So I think I answered that question, actually. So I'll just move on to the follow-up here. Is there any historical trace of hiccups or idiosyncrasies of the Buddha that would give him a human face? Well, it's kind of hard because we're looking through 2,500 years of like devotionalistic glorification of the Buddha, where he is portrayed as just the perfect, ideal Indian saint. But still, you can pick up a few little things. It doesn't mention him with hiccups, I'm pretty sure. Maybe he did have hiccups. He had some kind of problems where Jivaka, his physician, was giving him like aromatherapies, having him smelling flowers and so forth. He did have things go wrong with him, like right before he died, he had like really like dysentery, like bloody diarrhea, just really intense abdominal pains and so forth, presumably after eating some spoiled pork. He didn't like noise. He would scold people. Like there was a little bit of a scolding quoted above in a previous question where the Buddha was calling some monk a silly person, probably what is it, Moga Purisa, or just an empty person. Yeah, he would make fun of people sometimes if he was scolding them, but it was generally monks, his disciples. He wouldn't just be like chewing out lay people, that sort of thing. He had sort of a very dry sense of humor. You can find some humor in the text, although, he's not like yucking it up. He never laughs or cries, although he does smile faintly from time to time. Um, let's see. Gosh. Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to find the original Buddha through the texts. I mean, it'd be almost as difficult as knowing what the original Hercules or the original Achilles was like just from reading, the ancient Greek poems. So, yeah, I mean, he is portrayed as just the ideal, perfect Indian sage, and so he doesn't really have any um, vices or even like weird habits, anything like that. But he didn't like noise. That's true. I mean, he'd get on the case of monks if they were being too noisy sometimes. But yeah, it's hard to say. I think I better just move on to the next question. This is from Arain. And Arain says, years ago, a friend of mine wanted to learn how to meditate. An acquaintance who supposedly knew how, non-Buddhist, sat her down in her apartment one day and showed her. It was her first time. She ended up pretty freaked out because as she sat and meditated, she suddenly found herself experiencing being outside the apartment building where we lived downtown, yet the streets were empty and devoid of life or cars. What was happening here? It could be that she went into a kind of hypnotic trance. It may not have been a like a genuine out of body experience if she's not seeing what was actually there. That she was floating around outside the apartment building, but like the streets were completely empty and with no life or cars. So I would assume that she went into a kind of hypnotic trance state and was imagining it. That would be my guess. And so probably the meditation technique was not the best. Um, Probably just some sort of auto hypnosis thing that was being taught rather than like genuine mindfulness where anything like that happens, you don't identify with it, you don't attribute significance to it, you just note it and let it go, note it and let it go, note it and let it go. Either that or just concentrating on your breath going in and out or something like that. Those would be more safe, more Buddhist kind of meditations, but I'm not exactly sure what the meditation technique was here, so I can't really say for sure. So we'll just move on to Arian's next question. I see a few monks online always working on social media, setting up online fundraisers and asking for people to send them cash for various reasons. How does this conform to the Vinaya, and isn't the local community supposed to support monks? Monks pandering for cash on social media seems like a dangerous slope to tread down. What could possibly go wrong there, right? What is the proper way for lay people interacting with monks asking for cash? Also, what about donating to a monastery versus an individual monk? Yeah, there are monks, including some supposedly strict ones, who are fundraising or asking for donations, or maybe they're trying to go around the Vinaya rule against asking for money by just saying, well, the monastery could really use money. We need the money to, get this website going good or to make repairs on the monastery or something. But even hinting like that technically is against the rules. I mean, a monk is allowed to say, well, we need to upgrade our website, or we need to fix the monastery. But if you start hinting like you want money for it, then you're already you've crossed the line. Even though it's really difficult for a monk living in the West, especially, not to have anything at all to do with money, because strictly speaking, a monk should not have anything at all to do with money. Like when I was even when I was an abbot at a monastery in Burma, we needed a bag of concrete. I couldn't say, buy me a bag of concrete. I could say, I need a bag of concrete. I could say, could you get me a bag of concrete? But I couldn't say, could you buy me a bag of concrete? Because you can't tell other people what to do with their money other than just say, do what makes you happy. So, um, yeah, it is kind of fudging on the rules. Um, Bhante Gunaratana, who's one of the most famous monks in America, he was like the head cashier for the Vihara book service for years and years. And most Asian monks especially they just handle money and just don't care. With regard to Western monks, I'd guess about half of Western monks handle money. But even the ones who are trying to be strict, like in the Ajahn Chah tradition, um, they just don't know the rules well enough, or else it's just such a colossal inconvenience not even telling people what to do with money, or like endorsing checks or something, that they just go ahead and do it. And they just try to do it as little as possible. And I had a teacher who was like that. I mean, he didn't handle money himself, but still he'd be telling the monastery attendant, go buy this and go get that, which still breaking the rule, but at least he wasn't handling it himself, which is kind of a step in the right direction anyhow. So let's see, what is the proper way for people interacting with monks asking for cash? Well, I mean, you're just helping them break rules. So, I mean, if you're okay with helping them break rules, then yeah, you can give them money. But if they are asking for cash, it's kind of futile to say, well, do you have an attendant that I could discuss the money with? Because if he's asking for the cash, he's just going to ask the attendant to give him the money. I went to a Thai monastery in Washington State near Seattle. And the first time I went there, the abbot was at the bank. So, I mean, it's just really common. See, what is the proper way for lay people interacting with monks asking for cash? The really proper way is just tell them you really shouldn't be asking for cash, Blante. I'm not going to give any. I mean, if you I mean, if you were following the rules, I'd donate to the attendant or something. But if you're just flat out asking for money, I mean, I'd rather donate the money to a monk who's actually trying to follow Vinaya correctly. I mean, you could say that. I mean, it'd be kind of an assholish thing to say maybe, but I mean, that would be the proper way of doing it. Or just don't say anything, just leave. I don't know. Let's see. Also, what about donating to a monastery versus an individual monk? Yeah, well, you can donate money to a monastery, and if they've got like a board of directors or like an attendant who lives there and the monks are strict, yeah, that would be the way to do it. In fact, you could just ask them what they need and go out and buy it yourself. But as I already mentioned, though, if the attendant there is just handing the money over to the monks anyway, then I mean, it's not really an improvement. He's just kind of a money laundering operation. So, yeah, I mean, the rules against Theravada Buddhist monastics handling money are very strict. And it's really a problem for Western monks. I've read 3 articles written by Western monks, strict Western monks, regarding the money rules. And all 3 of them were basically saying, how much can you actually handle money without breaking the rule? One of them was Ajahn Brahm, although that's neither here nor there. Another one was Ajahn Tanisaro. Another one is an Australian monk who is no longer in robes. So I think I'll just move on to the next question here from Arain. Can you explain the specific reasons why MGTOW, feminism, sexual and racial identity ideologies are blatantly non-Buddhist? And then there's an addendum, or explain why they are Buddhist, as the woke American neo-Buddhists claim. Well, MGTOW, yeah, there's nothing wrong with MGTOW. I mean, there's different kinds of MGTOW now. Some MGTOW is just, you just go out and pick up on slutty women and have no commitment. But that's, in a way, that's a very inferior MGTOW that is blatantly against the Buddhist precepts. But just a guy being celibate or living alone, not having sex, not having a female significant other, or a male one. Yeah, that's just basic Buddhism right there. Feminism, it all depends on what kind of feminism is it. I mean, if it's feminism, like a feminist who really wants to help women and to uplift, the situation of women, and just going for just general equality, that's one thing. But feminists, like the man-hating variety, especially now, like the neo-Marxist intersectional variety, 3rd wave, 4th wave, whatever wave we're up to, yeah, I mean that is if it's based on resentment and just hostility and hatred or whatever, then yeah, it's not going to be good no matter what you're doing, because really it's the mental states that determine the moral quality of an action. Sexual and racial identity, yeah, sexual identity. I mean, identifying with your sexuality. I mean, yeah, I mean that's just kind of ridiculous, really. It's racial identity ideologies. I mean, in Buddhism, it's like you're not supposed to identify really as anything if you possibly can help it. Um, and with regard to the Sangha being ordained, there's a number of statements in the text referring to the Sanghas like the ocean, all the different rivers. These different rivers with different qualities just flow into the same ocean and just become the same ocean. And that's the way the Sangha was supposed to be. You're supposed to leave your ethnicity, your social class, all that stuff behind you. And then you just become a son of the Buddha. You're a monk or a nun. And so this emphasis on racial and sexual identity in modern Western Buddhism is essentially just almost the opposite of what Buddhism is supposed to be or was intended to be. So yeah, it is blatantly non-Buddhist, a lot of it. It's the cultural Marxism stuff that is becoming just really dominant in Western Buddhism. Is yeah, it's almost the exact opposite of Dharma in certain respects. You know, just the whole grievance grievance politics, you know, or just the whole like blaming the system for your plight in life. I mean, it may make perfect sense from a political, like spiritually bankrupt materialistic point of view, but from the Buddhist point of view, there is karma. And so if you are born, you know, in a female body, that's your karma. You're born in a male body, that's your karma. You're born in a black body, a white body. I mean, that's you put yourself there. So yeah, I mean, the identity politics stuff that has pretty much taken over Western Buddhism, especially in academia. You read academic Buddhist papers, it's like clown world. Really, a lot of it is just total clown world. So yeah, I think I answered that one. So I think I'll move on to Arian's next question. And that is it possible for a child or baby to become enlightened? What about being born as an arahant or enlightened? I'm thinking of examples of some very young and very small children through history and modern times who seem to be extremely grounded and unusually full of profound wisdom that takes most people a lifetime to learn into old age. I suppose New Age people would call them old souls. Well, just by random coincidence, I happened to read a J.D. Salinger story just the other night called Teddy about this boy about 9 years old who is enlightened. Um, the thing was that in the story, he was like some sort of Indian holy man or a yogi in his previous life, and then he dropped out and got married or something. And he said that he was going to have to be reborn again anyway, that he wasn't fully enlightened in his previous life. Even if he had stayed a yogi, he still wouldn't have gotten enlightened. But because he sort of took this turn to the left, he was reborn to this in this dysfunctional family in New York City instead of being reborn in the holy land of India. And but I'm digressing because that's just a fictional story. But it reminded me of that because I had just read it just a few nights ago. Um, there are stories in the texts of boys who are being ordained as novices at around the age of 9, who, at the first touch of the razor to their head as they're getting their head shaved, they become enlightened. So there are enlightened children in the texts. Um, so yeah, it obviously happens. With regard to being born enlightened, um, I'm not sure how that would work because if you were already enlightened before you were born, then you wouldn't get born again, according to Orthodox Theravada. Um, I think it's some Hindus, maybe some Mahayana Buddhists do think that after you become enlightened, just because it's the right thing to do or whatever, you just keep taking life after life. Like Neem Karoli Baba was supposed to be like that. Um, you know, even after he became enlightened, supposedly, so the story goes, you know, he just kept being reborn in or sort of, you know, out of compassion or because it really didn't matter because he wasn't really identified with the body or anything anymore anyway. Um, so being born an arahant, that's according to Theravada Buddhism, I don't think it would happen unless you somehow became enlightened while you were like a fetus. And I've never heard of any cases of that. But children definitely can become enlightened. They have to be very ripe, though. I mean, they have to be sort of like Teddy was, where they're, you know, almost there before they're born. And it doesn't take very much, you know, just like the touch of the razor on the head, and that's it. Just boop. So, yeah, New Age people would call them old souls. My father would have called them old souls too. So I'll just move on to the next question. Man, we're getting up to 2 hours. Yep. I might have to start doing these daily or something. This is from Achala. And Achala says, my parents want me to get married, and I also feel probably in a year or two it's about time, though looking around how divorce due to extramarital affairs is becoming a normal and common thing, even in the Indian culture. The concern of my parents and mine is how to find a faithful traditional wife. I feel like I want to marry someone who is Buddhist or has interest in the teachings of Buddha. How should I go about it? Thank you. Well, this is a tough question, partly because I really don't know Achala. It sounds like maybe he's ethnic Indian, not necessarily living in India. Um, I mean, the traditional way is you just let your parents deal with it, and they're the ones who fix you up. But yeah, it's a tough question because sometimes you just can't be sure. You got to take the gamble. You got to take the risk. And if you find a girl that you think is the one, and she seems like the right one, that she's going to be faithful, and you're going to be faithful to her, then it may be that you think it's worth the risk to take the chance on her. And it may be that it's just your karma that you're going to be married to an unfaithful woman or something. But need to drink this. If you want to find a woman who is Buddhist, then you may have to try and find a good Buddhist group where you can meet. But I mean, obviously, most Western Buddhist groups are. I mean, it's hardly Buddhism at all anymore. Maybe some elementary meditation techniques and a little bit of Pali jargon, but or Sanskrit jargon or Chinese jargon or whatever jargon is associated with that tradition. Um, yeah, I mean, you're just gonna have to do the best you can because I really don't have enough data to really give you advice. I mean, I could say, well, she's like 6 miles away heading due east, and just head in that direction, and she'll be out in the front yard in a blue dress, watering the flowers. But I really can't say that. So you're just gonna have to follow your heart and use some intelligence also, use some wisdom, and just try to find a girl that you have faith in, that you trust. And if you sincerely love her, then but by love, I'm not necessarily meaning the intoxication of the hormones, the animal mating instincts. I mean, that's completely unreliable. But I mean, if there's just a resonance between you and you sincerely love each other, then yeah, I think there's a good chance you'll be doing fairly well. But there's really no guarantees. There's no promises here. And sorry, I can't help you more with that. So the next and last question of the entire show is from the Arya Swasti Project. And the Arya Swasti Project says, if someone has attained higher states of consciousness through following the precepts, meditation, etc., and are reborn in that higher state, what causes them to revert back to human forms or lower? So how do you backslide from being in heaven, essentially? Because in Buddhism, heaven doesn't last forever. So what happens is you go up into heaven, and it may be you're in a lower level of heaven where you're just indulging in celestial orgies with harems of nymphs and so forth, and just enjoying sensual pleasures, the pleasure gardens and the golden palaces and all that, and till eventually all you're wallowing in debauchery, essentially. Just gives you enough bad karma that you leave that place and come back down as a human, or maybe worse than a human. Another possibility is you get up into like a formless realm, like a really advanced heaven realm. Like not advanced as in like necessarily, right at the verge of nirvana, because there's no heaven realm that really is at the verge of nirvana, because nirvana is completely off the scale. Nibbana is just kind of, I mean, you can't say that the highest heaven realm is any closer than the lowest hell. In a way, you can sort of, but really it's just totally off the scale. So let's say you're in some formless realm, the realm of neither perception nor non-perception, the realm of infinite space. Well, I mean, there's not much going on there. I mean, you're not making any new merit to keep you there. And so eventually the merit that got you there is just going to exhaust itself. And once it's exhausted, then you come back down again. And that's generally the way it works. You get into some heaven realm, the merit that got you up there eventually runs out. And you're not making enough merit up there just because, you're enjoying how nice it is or whatever, that you eventually just come back down again. So that can happen. And I think I just answered all the questions. By golly, I hope I did. I mean, there's a few questioners that I'm not entirely sure I did justice to their questions, but I do my best. And if you've got questions about Buddhism, especially Buddhist philosophy, Eastern philosophy, to some degree even Western philosophy, just Buddhist monasticism, Burma, me personally, any question you think I might be able to answer, you're very welcome to ask them in the comments below. Or if you have access to my Subscribestar account, you can ask them there. Or if you have access to my Discord server, you can ask them there. And be happy.